Well, thank you for the songs this morning. We'll be going to Genesis chapter number 40, continuing our series through the book of Genesis. This is message number 41 in that series. This message is entitled Forgotten Dreams. We're looking at Genesis chapter 40, and I'm going to start by reading verses 1 to 4. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in the ward. So as the sun was sinking in Genesis chapter number 15, we're told that Abram fell into darkness, in a deep sleep. And there the Lord spoke to him and promised him that the nation that would come from him would go into a foreign land, a land that was not theirs, for 400 years. And in that land, they would become slaves and they would suffer. But God also promised Abram that he would visit them to bring them back to the land that was theirs through the covenant that he had made with Abram. And that very promise began to be fulfilled with Joseph going into Egypt. Now, of course, Joseph didn't go to Egypt as a traveler. He wasn't there as a tourist. He wasn't there conducting business. He didn't go there by his own choice. Joseph went to Egypt as a slave because his brothers hated him and sold him to merchants, who in turn sold him to the officer Potiphar. So after Joseph had two dreams that revealed he would be exalted and even his family subjected to him, he suffered, and he suffered more and more humiliation. And that's where we are in Joseph's story here at this point in the book of Genesis. So the last time we looked at chapter number 39, and chapter 39 recounts Joseph's time in Potiphar's house. He entered the house as a common Hebrew slave, but he was very successful in his work that he was doing. And he was successful to the point that he was eventually promoted to the position of being steward over the entire house of Potiphar. But Joseph again faced adversity as Potiphar's wife approached him regularly, trying to seduce him, which he resisted, but her false accusations against him led to Joseph being put into prison. Now, Psalm 105 and verse 18, when referring to Joseph in this account, actually adds that Joseph was hurt. In other words, he was physically hurt in prison, meaning he was roughly treated, possibly even some sort of torturous that he endured when he was first thrown into the royal prison. Now, some scholars have suggested that the fact that Potiphar didn't have him executed, which certainly was within his purview to do, was possibly due to the fact that maybe he didn't believe his wife entirely about the account of Joseph. And that certainly could be possible, but whether that's true or not, Moses makes it unmistakably clear who it was that was directing Joseph's path. So 4 times in chapter 39, Moses notes that the Lord was with Joseph. He tells us that twice when he was in Potiphar's house in verses 2 and 3. He tells us that twice in reference to the prison in verses 21 to 23. Twice we are also told that the Lord made Joseph successful or made him prosper at whatever he did. We're told that in Potiphar's house in verse 3, again in the prison in verse 23. Twice we are told that the Lord gave Joseph favor in the eyes of those who were over him, in Potiphar's house in verses 3 to 4, and the prison warden in verse number 21. We're also twice told that everything was trusted into Joseph's hands by Potiphar in verse 4, by the prison warden again in verses 22 and 23. And we're also told there that God showed Joseph his chesed, his mercy, his covenant, loyal mercy, and loving kindness. And he showed him these things and gave him all of this favor. So again, Moses makes it completely clear, regardless of what the motivations and the actions of these different people were that were involved, that God was ruling over all, and he had Joseph exactly where he wanted him to be, though certainly that probably is not where Joseph would have wanted to be if you had asked him. So Joseph's life to this point can be a little confusing. When we read about Joseph's life, Joseph is one that's again, he's presented to us not like Jacob. You know, Jacob, we're shown, as the old saying is, warts and all of a lot of flaws with Jacob, even flaws with Isaac, and even flaws with Abraham that we see. And when it comes to Joseph, we're just presented a picture of a man living in integrity and seeking to do what's right. And Joseph continued to do what's right, and he seemed to suffer because of it. He would succeed and he would rise only to be knocked down again. Well, Psalm 105:19 also tells us that God tested Joseph. So just like the patriarchs before him, his faith was tested through various adversities that he suffered. Now, we also have the benefit of reading this story, just like Israel on the plains of Moab, knowing how the story turns out. And Joseph, of course, can't see it. When he's in Potiphar's house, when he's in the prison, he can't see how that it's going to turn out. But reading this story, we know how it's going to turn out. And we're able to see that every one of these downward steps for Joseph is actually a step that's leading him closer to that high exaltation that was revealed to him by those dreams a few years before this. Well, now we come to chapter 40. And chapter 40 tells us about Joseph's time in prison. There were two high ranking officials in Pharaoh's house who are put into prison where Joseph is. Not only is Joseph there, but Joseph is actually in a somewhat of a position of leadership of all the prisoners by this time. Now, this chapter gives us the seventh and the eighth dreams that we encounter in the book of Genesis. And if you remember, Genesis has 10 dreams, which is almost half of all the dreams that are in the Bible, 10 of them in the book of Genesis. And 6 out of those 10 are given in this last section of Genesis that begins in chapter 37, which is the story of Joseph mainly. And in this last section, we have 6 out of these 10 dreams, and all 6 of them have to do with Joseph in some way. 2 are dreams that Joseph himself had, and the other 4 are dreams that others had and Joseph interpreted. So these dreams are the first that we encounter in Genesis in this chapter. They're the first that require interpretation. Now, prior to Joseph, the dreams were not symbolic dreams in Genesis that we saw. They were rather direct speech from God saying, do something or don't do something. Now, this chapter contributes to the important history of Israel, and it also gives us insight into Joseph as a man of faith. In other words, what does living by faith look like? And obviously prepares us for what's ahead in the account and as far as the rest of Genesis is concerned in the history of Israel. So we're going to look at this chapter in 2 parts. In verses 1 to 19, where we encounter the 2 dreams, and in verses 20 to 23, where we see 2 results. So the 2 dreams, let's begin here. We'll reread verses 1 to 4. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against 2 of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in the ward. So the butler that is mentioned here is also what we might refer to as a cupbearer for the king. And he and the baker, as you read in these first few verses, are also identified as being chiefs. They were a chief butler and a chief baker. In other words, they were actually high-ranking officials over the cupbearers and the bakers, respectively. So, in other words, these were not just menial servants, but these were top officials within Pharaoh's government or household, or however you want to look at that. And most likely, they even performed some sort of advisory role to Pharaoh. In other words, they were close to him, and especially that the role of the cupbearer, because he was the one that was over the drink and the food and these things, checking for the poisoning and all that sort of thing that his enemies might try to do. So he necessarily was very close to the Pharaoh in his daily duties, and had a lot of insight into the inner workings and the inner goings on of the government there in Egypt. So these are actually very high ranking, very important officials in Pharaoh's court. Now, somehow we're told that they offended Pharaoh, and that he was very angry with them, and he had them put into prison. Now, we're not told what the events were that led to this, what the actions were. Don't really know. The language that is used here, though, it does indicate some kind of a wrongdoing that we might consider criminal. And this resulted in them being put into prison, or at least the accusation of some sort of wrongdoing of that nature. Now, the prison, we find, was part of Potiphar's house, part of the captain of the guard's house, and that was Potiphar that we was introduced to in the previous chapter. And it was apparently a prison for just such high-ranking officials. So it was be more considered like a royal prison rather than more of a common prison. So servants of pharaohs and of that sort of thing. Probably in today's terms, we might think of it more maybe like a government prison, or maybe even more, a little somewhat like a military prison, as opposed to more of a common prison. Now, the captain of the guard here, and again, we were introduced to the captain of the guard, Potiphar, in the previous chapter, and he's not named here. But he puts these two in the charge of Joseph, which would seem to indicate that not only had Joseph gained the favor of the prison warden that we read about right at the very end of the last chapter, but he had also in some way regained favor from Potiphar, at least to some extent. And these two prisoners were put into the prison under his charge for an unspecified amount of time. And time is a little interesting when you're looking at this account, because when you add up from the time that Joseph was sold into slavery until he appears before Pharaoh, I think it comes out to something like 11 years. So there certainly was years of time that have passed with Joseph, part of that spent in Potiphar's house, part of that spent in the prison. And we don't know exactly how all of that divides up, but this seems to be moving very quickly. But really realize this has happened over time, that Joseph has gained favor and has gained position, whether it was in Potiphar's house or whether it was in the prison. And so now he's put these are put in his charge, these high-ranking prisoners from Pharaoh's court. Let's look at verses 5 to 8. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his Lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. So on the same night, this cupbearer and this baker each had a dream that was obviously a dream from the Lord. And apparently, these dreams were troubling to them as they appeared distressed. And that's what the words indicate when Joseph saw them the next day. They appeared to be distressed over these dreams. And they were distressed because they didn't have access to a dream interpreter. Now, the word for interpret that is used here is a word that specifically speaks of interpreting dreams. It's not used very often in the Bible, only about 9 times, and every time that it is used, it is in relation to interpreting of dreams. It's always used that way. Now, the tradition of dream interpretation is something that was well attested in ancient Egypt. There were scrolls that were written about it, and records of sorts that were kept. And people were actually trained up in this art of being able to interpret dreams and such. And so this is what the baker and the butler in this prison didn't have any access to, and this is what they were disturbed by. They understood that these were some sort of unusual dreams, that they had some sort of meaning, but they didn't know what it was, and they didn't have access to anyone that did. Now, of course, then Joseph speaks to them, says, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Now, Joseph was one who had no such training. He had no such recognition in the field of dream interpretation among the Egyptians. But he states very plainly to them that all interpretations belong to God. The point being that God gave dreams as revelation in the times before the written word was complete. And as the author of the dreams, he was the source of their meaning. That doesn't mean that every dream that was ever dreamed was some sort of a revelation from God. But Joseph obviously recognized that he discerned, I might say, that there was something about these dreams. So Joseph, in this simple statement that he gives, and you have to think now, Joseph has, for years, he was a slave in Potiphar's house. He's now been, for some time, probably years at this point, has been in this prison. And Joseph still yet is here recognizing that God is over all, that God is in control of all, even though he has just went from bad to worse in terms of his position. And he's in this prison. He's still saying, well, God, all interpretations belong to God. All knowledge, all truth, all revelation, it's God's. And so tell me the dream. In other words, because he is a faithful servant of God. So he still recognized that God was over all. And then we get to the dreams themselves. The first one we'll look at here, the dream of the cupbearer in verses 9 to 15. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. And it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon." So the dream of the cupbearer was what we would refer to as a symbolic dream. So this is different, for instance, than the dream that Jacob had telling him to go home, or the dream of Abimelech telling him, not to do anything, those sort of things. This was a symbolic dream. So in the dream, this butler sees a vine, and particularly a vine with 3 branches. And it budded, blossomed, and grew fruit. The cupbearer had Pharaoh's cup, and he took the grapes, pressed them, and gave the cup to Pharaoh. So you notice that the number 3 is repeated in this dream, and both the cupbearer and Pharaoh were present. So then we get the interpretation. Joseph said the 3 branches were 3 days, and that in 3 days Pharaoh would restore the cupbearer to his former position. But then, after interpreting the dream, Joseph asks to be remembered. Remember me. In other words, put in a good word for me when you are restored, and he obviously have access to Pharaoh. And then Joseph pled his case to this cupbearer. He says that he was stolen away, and we might use the term today, kidnapped, as it were, from his homeland. And it's worth noting that he calls it here the land of the Hebrews being those descendants of Abraham, though they didn't actually own it. They didn't actually possess it. In other words, the description that he gives of this land shows that Joseph has faith in God's promises, the promises that he made to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, that he would give them this land, this nation that he would make of Abraham, that they would inherit and would possess this land. He said, I was taken away out of the land of the Hebrews, out of the land that belongs to them by the promise of God. So again, even in this prison, even in this situation, Joseph is continuing to show his faith in God. Furthermore, he explains that he's innocent of any wrongdoing and has been unjustly imprisoned. Now, obviously, this was a reasonable request for Joseph to make. It certainly was an opportunity. And of course, again, Joseph showing his faith in God, he has to believe that these dreams that he had are going to come to pass. I mean, God had revealed this to him, so he doesn't know how that it's going to come to pass, but he's got to believe that it's going to. So surely I'm going to get out of this prison. And so he gives this request. Well, then we get the next dream, verses 16 to 19. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. So we're told that the chief baker was encouraged by the good interpretation that the chief cupbearer had received pertaining to his dream. And so the baker in his dream, he's carrying 3 baskets with food and supplies, whatever all might have been in all of the baskets, on top of his head. And the top and had this bread or some sort of goods in the top basket. And he's carrying these things for Pharaoh. And in his dream, the birds ate what was in that top basket. So Joseph likewise interprets his dream. In 3 days, he said the baker would be brought out of the prison and would be beheaded, most likely is the indication of what he's saying, and that his body would be impaled on a stake. In other words, it would be displayed publicly after his execution. And then the carrion birds would then eat it. And this sort of execution and display most likely meant that he was guilty of some high crime against Pharaoh, possibly guilty of some sort of conspiracy or some sort of treasonous act or whatever the case may be. And he was obviously going to be publicly made an example of. And then we get to the last part as this chapter closes in verses 20 to 23, where we now get 2 results. The first result we see in verses 20 to 22. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Now, Moses is careful to note here in these verses that each of these dreams were fulfilled just as Joseph had interpreted them. So the chief butler was restored and he regains his position. The chief baker was hanged on display. And again, the lifting up of the head and the language that is used, most likely he was executed and hung up that way as a matter of an example. But the point is that God had given Joseph the interpretation. God had given these dreams. God had given the interpretation, and they were fulfilled exactly as they had been given. In other words, Joseph was correct. And then we get the second result, which is in verse 23. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. So the chapter ends with this note that Joseph was forgotten. In other words, the chief butler did not remember Joseph as he had asked him to do. By saying that he was forgotten, you would think that maybe he had the intention of remembering him, but nevertheless, he forgot him. Now, so in this immediate story, and that's the story of Joseph's life that we are currently in this section of Genesis, in the immediate story, we see Joseph once again succeeding only to be brought down. He gave the correct interpretation of the dreams. They were fulfilled exactly as Joseph said they would be, and then he's forgotten. So he once again is humiliated. Now, of course, we know that this is not going to be permanent, but it was a blow to Joseph. Joseph seemed to suffer again and again, even though it was so evident that God was with him. I mean, Joseph even said before he heard the dreams, interpretations belong to God, so you can tell them to me. And the implication being, God will give me the interpretation. And then he gives the interpretation and he gets it correct. Again, once again, he's done the right thing. He's demonstrated that God is with him, and yet he's knocked down yet again. Now, in the larger story, and this would be the larger story, the history of Israel that the Pentateuch is concerned with. In the larger story, Moses is emphasizing here how that Joseph was forgotten. And he says that he remembered him not, but forgot him. So he's emphasizing how that Joseph was forgotten. And he's foreshadowing the fact that Joseph will again be forgotten in the opening chapter of Exodus, where Joseph will be forgotten by a new Pharaoh that arises that did not know him. And the good favor that Israel had gained through Joseph is forgotten, and Israel will be confined to hard labor and slavery. Because once again, this promise that God made to Abraham concerning the future of that nation and them going into this strange land is beginning to be fulfilled right here with Joseph in Egypt. All right, so as we think about chapter number 40, and we think about Joseph's story, the story of Joseph's life is one of suffering and adversity. And we have seen that in the patriarchs before him. We have seen them come up against obstacles. We've seen them enduring various conflicts. In other words, as they have proceeded forward, it seems like they keep encountering events and people that would make them question, well, how is God going to keep this promise? I mean, you go back with Abraham and you think how Abraham was promised that he's going to have a son. But yet his wife Sarah is barren, and for 25 years they didn't have any children after God had promised, and they didn't have any children before that. So how is this going to be possible? How can this be true? How is this going to be fulfilled? And as we come through Genesis, we've traced with each one of these patriarchs how that they've encountered adversity and conflict and obstacles and difficulties and things that all seem to be saying God's promises will be forgotten. But of course, God does not forget his promises, and that is the point. And in the case of the previous patriarchs, we could also add that at times they were just less than stellar in their actions. We can think of times with Abraham and with Isaac, and certainly times with Jacob when they really weren't making the best of choices. But yet Joseph continues to be presented to us one that's just maintaining integrity and faith. He's the one that's doing what's right, and he seems to be being punished for it. He gets knocked down time and time again. Well, on the one hand, if we think back to earlier in the book of Genesis, leading up to the time of the flood, in fact, we realize how quickly that sin spread throughout the earth, and how quickly that the earth just became filled with violence and evil. And then after the flood, we see again that rapid spread of sin. The difference being that now God has covenanted with Noah and with all humankind that he's not going to send another flood like he did that flood when he destroyed every living thing off the face of the earth. But rather, After the flood, it's revealed to us that God has chosen Abraham, and he's promised to make a nation from him. And through him, he's going to bless all the nations of the earth. And that promise seems very far from being fulfilled as the descendants of Abraham encounter so much suffering, so much adversity, so many obstacles. But Moses wanted the children of Israel to know, the children of Israel that are about to enter the promised land. Moses knows he's not entering that promised land, and he's written this account for them before they enter into that land. And he wants them to realize that they were where they were at, ready to enter into the promised land because of God's promises and because of God's faithfulness to his promises. Because they certainly had not always been what they should be. They certainly had not always walked in faith and obedience. And all the way back in the patriarchs, we see all of these problems and all these adversities, but yet you're here because God keeps his promises. And you're about to enter into this land, and you're going to possess this land, though not that generation, but ultimately they will, because God has promised. So again, we think back of Psalm 105 and verse 19 that tells us how that God tested Joseph. And of course, you can read the same if you go into the book of Deuteronomy, how that God tested Israel in the wilderness. How that our faith that we're told from beginning even to the end in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, how that our faith is tested and tried. And we certainly see that in the case of Joseph. So Israel should understand that they were being tested. And as they enter into that land and they face these many nations that aren't all that glad to see them coming through and are willing to eliminate them if they can. Well, they are to walk by faith, realizing that they will be tested. So lastly, we see this emphasis here again on the sovereignty of God. That God is the one that is in control, that God is the one that is orchestrating these events. In other words, these events in the life of Joseph, they're not just coincidental events. It's not just a random string of things that happened to Joseph. These things have meaning, and Joseph recognizes that. Even what he says about God, to him belongs the interpretation of dreams. But again, when you get to the end of Genesis, in Genesis chapter number 50, Joseph acknowledges that God meant these things for a good purpose. So we also must not forget, even in the account of Joseph, how time and again we're told that God was with him. So on the one hand, we're constantly reminded that God was with Joseph. God was blessing Joseph. God was prospering Joseph. But then on the other hand, we think, but wait, Joseph goes from being the favored son of his father and on his way to this high standing in the family, to being thrown in a pit, to being sold into slavery by his brothers, to being a slave in Potiphar's house, to ending up in the prison. And now once again, he's forgotten. And we read at the beginning of the next chapter how it was 2 years after this time that Joseph just continued on in this prison. But yet, God was with him. God was with him. God was blessing him. So we also need to not forget how that God is with us. And even in the adversity, even in the difficulty, even in the trying of our faith, it doesn't mean that God's forsaken us. No, God is with us, just like he has been with Joseph. He's with us today, those who believe in him. And we also have this assurance that no matter what happens in this life, that God will keep all of his promises. He's going to keep them to Abraham, and it means he's going to keep them to us as well. All right, that's all of our message for this morning. We will close with a hymn.